Welcome to South Carolina Community Loan Fund's third session of the Investing in Community Summit Series. The Summit Series is a monthly panel discussion focusing on the mission areas of South Carolina Community Loan Fund. I'm Kelly Sharkey. I'm the program manager here at South Carolina Community Loan Fund. This is for South Carolina communities. At SCCLF, we believe that everyone deserves a safe and affordable place to call home, and every community needs their own approach to creating affordable housing. Installment of the Summit Series, we will talk with housing experts from across the state, communities' housing challenges and development. One of SCCLF's mission areas is affordable housing. If you are interested in affordable housing development, we are here to assist. Reach out to your area's community to discuss the lending process. Before we get started, I want to launch a quick poll to see where all of our attendees are viewing from. One could answer the poll question I'm about to launch. We just want to kind of gauge where everyone is. We have had 185 people register for this event, so we want to just welcome everyone. Let's see, we got some more responses coming in. We got a lot from state. All right, so there's some of us not in South Carolina. Let's see what we got here. All right, so I'm going to close this poll. And yeah, it looks like we have people from the upstate, the low country, and the Midlands. So thank you all so much. Welcome. Before we jump into our discussion, I just wanted to note a few housekeeping rules. If you have questions during this session, we ask that you type them in the question feature on the GoToWebinar panel. We have a minute question and answer session before ending the panel officially at 2 o'clock. Now we have a jam-packed discussion. As I said earlier, we have quite a few people joining us this afternoon, so we have planned to extend the session past 2 o'clock if need be. The session will be recorded and automatically emailed out to everyone who registered. We will also post it on our Summit Series YouTube page so you can access it anytime. Our moderator today is Anna Lewin. She is the CEO of the Carolina Community Loan Fund. Without further ado, I'm going to hand it off to Anna.
Everyone. Like Kelly said, we do have a jam-packed session today with just a ton of expertise, and we are so grateful to have our panelists with us today. I think we'll have a very good, robust discussion, and hopefully you all will participate with us by putting questions in the chat box to move us along and to make sure that we're getting to the issues that you want to hear addressed. So with us today, we have Debbie Wade, who is a career-long housing advocate and SCCLF board member. We've got Martin Livingston, who is the Community Development Director for the City of Spartanburg, also an SCCLF board member. Amy Barrett, who is the CEO of the Urban Land Institute in South Carolina, and then Brian Grady, who is the Director of Research at SC Housing. So tons of knowledge on this panel. We're so glad you are here. For those of you who may not be aware, South Carolina Community Loan Fund actually got its start about 15 years ago as a local affordable housing trust fund. And so affordable housing, as Kelly mentioned, is part of our mission. It will always be part of our mission. It is a component of our mission that is near and dear to our hearts, because so many issues around equitable access and access to essential facilities and services sort of hinge on access to the availability of affordable housing. So we really appreciate you being here today and taking your time, your valuable time. I know we're all busy, to learn along with us. So that being said, We're going to go ahead and jump right in. And Brian, if it's okay, I'd like to start with you and kind of get sort of from the statewide perspective, kind of the state of the state of affordable housing. I know you all just finished a housing needs assessment and would be interested to hear about that, but then also what you're seeing in terms of the impact of COVID on affordable housing.
Sure. So absolutely. First off, thanks everybody for coming out to hear about this important topic from everybody. So yes, as Anna mentioned, we at SC Housing, State Housing Authority, published a housing needs assessment about a year ago now in terms of the first component of that. And certainly was, I think, alarming for a number of people in terms of just the state of affairs. And obviously this was all pre-COVID. This was, when the economy was still moving in a positive direction. So you have numbers like a quarter of all renters are spending at least half of their income on rent and utilities in South Carolina. As has been widely discussed, we have, by a fairly wide margin, the highest eviction rate of any other state in the country. Sort of the big picture number that was in there was this shelter poverty analysis that I did, and it found that there is essentially an $8.4 billion affordability gap in the state of South Carolina. That's money that people cannot spend on other essentials of living, whether that's transportation, childcare, food, clothing, because they are spending more than they can afford on housing. And so that's obviously a human tragedy, but it's also $8.4 billion that is not injected into the state's economy. And that's obviously a substantial, headwind that's imposed because we don't have affordable housing for the people of South Carolina. And again, even pre-pandemic, of all public school children in South Carolina, about 1 in 60 did not have a permanent place to live. And again, that's before the pandemic. So out of every 2 or 3 classrooms, there's a kid who, is staying on a relative's couch or may actually be on the street. So that was a lot of sobering statistics there. And now it's all worse, unfortunately. The harrowing thing about the COVID recession, if you will, is that even more so than previous downturns in the economy, this absolutely cut the legs out from the people at the bottom of the economic ladder. One of the statistics that I cite from Raj Chetty's research team, he's a Harvard professor, he's looked a lot at economics of opportunity. In South Carolina, since from the start of the pandemic to now, if you are a high or middle wage worker, there are actually more of them than there were before the pandemic. There's been job creation at the top. If you're a low wage worker, there's a 1 in 10 chance you lost your job, which is pretty dramatic. So you're essentially dealing with, and the reason why this is, you think about the businesses that either were compelled to close by the governor's order or saw a dramatic decrease in demand. You're talking about restaurants, hotels, salons. Who works there? Those are overwhelmingly going to be low wage workers. They're overwhelmingly going to be renters. So there is an eviction, we called it an eviction crisis before, so it would be, I guess, an eviction emergency. There's currently the CDC eviction moratorium, which does require tenants to affirmatively assert it, and it requires the magistrate to understand what the document is and approve that document. So there's that moratorium through the end of the year, but the most recent estimate, which was commissioned by our agency's trade organization, the National Council of State Housing Agencies, found that when that moratorium ends in January, there are likely to be up to 120,000 eviction filings, and that's 1 out of every 5 renters in the state of South Carolina. And the reason why that is because of all the back rent. Even if somebody got their job back, if they were living paycheck to paycheck, they're not going to be able to make up their rent for April or May after the fact. So we're looking at a rent gap of between $329 and $429 million. So that's money that renters can't pay, but it's also money that the property owner doesn't have. And certainly if it's a mom and pop landlord, that may be financially ruinous to them. So there's a lot to work with there. But the situation is certainly, it was not good before, and it is certainly not better after.
Yeah, those are sobering statistics. I had not heard the one from your national association. It's quite unsettling at best. What resources are available at the state housing level for either tenants or providers of affordable housing to address some of these COVID related needs that have existed obviously pre-COVID, but that have just been so exacerbated as a result of the pandemic?
Right. So earlier, I believe in May, our board did authorize us to essentially, we had a $5 million emergency fund, and it's an emergency. So we deployed those resources into a rental assistance fund, which we worked with SC Thrive to administer. That fund is now closed to new applicants. But certainly that was one way in which we were able to deploy resources. There are other resources that were in the CARES Act stimulus in March that allocate additional money for community development block grants, emergency solutions grants, that directed additional revenue particularly toward eviction prevention and those sorts of programs. But a lot of those were administered at the local level, either the city or the county or the continuum of care. There's certainly a need for obviously further assistance on that front. So beyond that, one of the main things that we do at SC Housing is help finance the production of affordable housing, and that's primarily through the low-income housing tax credit program. One of the things that the legislature and the governor saw fit to do this year was pass the Workforce and Senior Affordable Housing Act. And what that does is essentially produce a one-for-one match. So for every dollar in federal credits that we allocate to a development that succeeded in its application process, that is matched by a credit on state taxes. So that will allow us, because of various complicated financial things, it's not going to double our capacity to deploy resources through the 9% tax credit program, but it should substantially increase that. The state tax credit has already had an impact in our tax exempt bond program, which is often paired with less valuable 4% credits. And I know I'm getting in the weeds here, but that program was closed due to COVID. We reopened it in September, and for the first time, I believe, ever in South Carolina, we received more applications than we could actually fund. So we're now in the position, because of the state tax credit, of being able to max out the bond volume authority that the agency has to deploy resources to affordable housing development. So the bad news, of course, is that developing a tax credit property typically takes about 2 years on average from the initial funding to getting a full building of tenants. But certainly that's going to help in the long run with the economic recovery of substantially increasing the amount of resources that we're able to deploy on an annual basis.
Yeah, that's great. That state low-income housing tax credit is such a win, such an important sort of tool in the toolbox. And so really, it's good to hear that you guys are already seeing an impact for that, and hopefully an increase now in the supply of housing that is so desperately needed in every part of the state. Amy, we're gonna pivot to you. Let's talk, and actually, like LIHTC and the QAP process may be a good sort of segue to start talking about ULI's work on affordable housing and sort of some of the land use issues that we see as it relates to the production of affordable housing. That's kind of a big, broad question. But if you want to just start by telling us a little bit about ULI and about your all's work in affordable housing.
Yeah, thank you, Anna. And that is a really nice pivot point because we've been hearing a lot about the impact already of the state LIHTC program, and to the fact that we have a referendum here in Charleston County to create a housing fund here, and we've gotten some pushback. People say, well, we've gotten this state LIHTC problem, so isn't the problem solved? Which it's not. We want to avoid that, certainly, but it is interesting that people see the impact of that and the possibility of incentivizing more housing. So so yeah, I want to back up just a little bit and share with folks, if you're not familiar with the Urban Land Institute, just a little bit about who we are. We are a member-driven nonprofit organization, and our mission is to provide leadership in the responsible use of land. So our work on housing comes back to land use. Here in South Carolina, we have about 700 members. ULI is a national organization, but we have 700 members here in South Carolina, engaged in all kinds of work that touches land use in the built environment. About half our membership is our private sector developers, market rate developers, and commercial developers. And then the balance of that are people who are otherwise engaged in the built environment: planners, city staff members, architects, engineers, financial professionals. And I share that with the audience here today is because we are really a broad tent organization. And I think in these kind of conversations, particularly with issues that are complicated and really integrated across disciplinary like housing, I think our real strength is to have this broad tent of collaborators that can kind of come together and work on complicated issues. Just a little bit more about ULI's work and research is that we do have a national center called the Terwilliger Center for Housing that functions almost like a think tank. So I encourage everybody who's on the call today to check that out. And I can send some links and put those in the chat box if that would be helpful. But we do have a lot of research, again, focusing on land use and the land use issues in housing research, but also really importantly, best practices from across the country. Every community in the United States is struggling with these issues of how to provide more housing at the right level. And there are some lessons learned. Not every case study or best practice is suitable for our communities here in South Carolina, but there certainly are ways to learn about that, what's been working in other places and what hasn't too. But in terms of ULI South Carolina's work here in the housing space, what we've really been focused on is really bringing those national resources to bear and really convening conversations about housing, growth, and development in our communities. So I think we are really at our best when we can bring together those diverse stakeholders, including people who often have competing objectives and often don't agree on things, but bringing people together to really dig deep on these issues and their challenges so that we can have more meaningful and productive conversations about the solutions. And I'll share this with you guys too, that in preparing for this conversation, I've been thinking about housing and the multiple kind of facets of this one problem. And I do think, when we talk about housing is a little bit of a convenient bucket to talk about other problems that are really hard to face. And it's conveniently or not conveniently, these acute housing burdens are also felt by individuals. And I think, the real severe pain points are felt on an individual basis, not being able to pay the rent, getting evicted. And I think sometimes that can obscure our collective responsibility to really think about the structural reasons we find ourselves in this way. And so through conversations like this and other conversations throughout the state, I think it's a really, these conversations are really important and really fruitful, so we can kind of highlight the structural nature of these problems. And then finally, and then I'll let you ask another question, Anna, but I came across this quote that kind of summarizes that in a more articulate way than I just did. And it's a quote from Connor Daughtery, who wrote a book called Golden Gates, Fighting for Housing in America. And the quote is, nearly all of the biggest challenges in America are at some level a housing problem. Rising home costs are a major driver of segregation, inequality, and racial and generational wealth gaps. You can't talk about education or shrinking middle class without talking about how much it costs to live near good schools and high-paying jobs. Transportation accounts for about a third of the nation's carbon dioxide emissions, so there's no serious plan for climate change that doesn't begin with a conversation about how to alter the urban landscape so people can live closer to work. And I thought that that was really telling about the integrated nature and challenge of this problem that we call housing, but really encompasses much, much more. Do you want me to say a little bit more? Keep going. So again, I'm turning it back to ULI's work in South Carolina. I think in the housing space, we have 3 objectives that we're working on in a variety of ways. And one is to catalyze the production of housing. We need more housing units. I mean, that's an easy, or should be an easy math equation. We need more supply. And then number 2, to provide best practices in ways that we can share successes that are happening in our community. And then 3rd, inspire broader commitment to housing policy by bringing these different voices to the table so that we can learn from each other and bring all of our resources to bear, because as Brian said, it really is it's an emergency issue right now that was been building for a while, but more acute now because of COVID and other things happening in our economy. Do you want me to keep going?
We're having a little technical difficulties.
Okay. All right. Well,
Yeah.
yeah, I've got a couple other things to say, and I don't want to dominate, but would that be helpful? Do you want me to talk about some of the barriers, land use barriers?
Okay, I think we got it now.
Okay, I couldn't get off mute, no matter what I did. I was hitting unmute, it would not. Thank you, Amy. Please make your final point.
No, I'll leave it there because I do think I talked a little bit like more than my time, unless you do want me to talk a little bit about the barriers.
Well, that's what I was
regulatory.
trying to ask.
Okay.
How I couldn't get myself off mute. You know, you do have a really unique sort of vantage point, given that you're a statewide organization. ULI is a very sort of broad reaching organization, sort of a wide tent, if you will. Would you tell me, I mean, and obviously each community has its own set of unique challenges, but can you talk about some of the common sort of issues that are related to housing that you just see come up from time and time again, no matter where you are in the state and who's talking about it? Like, I think I could probably tell you anecdotally what I think those things are, but I'd love to hear just what you're hearing day to day in your world as you bring unique and diverse stakeholders together.
Yeah, for sure, absolutely. Yeah, so there are again it is a layered challenge, right? So there are layered barriers that really come together to conspire or inhibit like what we really like to aspire to is a fully functioning housing ecosystem where you have builders who know how to build it, you have policy that enables it, you have funders who are willing to fund it. And I think there's some things that that again are not true for every community in South Carolina, but there's some kind of broad strokes that I think that are true. Across the board. And one is just, some of them are obvious. Like the first one is cost barriers, right? I mean, the rising cost of land. We have beautiful places in South Carolina, but some of them are hilly and some of them are soggy. And it's like, it really kind of makes it kind of costly and difficult from the get-go. But then you also have rising costs of labor and materials. And it really does make housing development, real estate development in general, just a risky endeavor under the best possible stressful circumstances, even when building really luxury communities. And I don't mean that to sound like a woe is me kind of, oh, the real estate developers are having a hard time, but I do think that sometimes is downplayed, and which is another kind of barrier that between these various stakeholders that come together to really contribute to a fully functioning housing ecosystem, and that's the communication barriers. Housing is complicated, right? When you think about just one project, the number of actors that are involved in bringing a project to bear is it's really astounding when you start thinking about it. And a lot of times those actors don't really communicate well amongst one another. So I think there's maybe a lot of misalignment in our economic development policy that's geared to bring jobs to our state, but then we don't have the resources to house people or build the roads. There's a misalignment with zoning policy and taxing policy. There's a lot of ways that we can better come together to be more strategic if what we're trying to do is really build more housing in the right places. And then just a couple notes on the regulatory barriers that we face. And again, this is different in every community. That maybe is one barrier overall, that every community is like hyper local in terms of how they support or prevent housing development in our communities. But I have to mention the primacy of single family zoning, and that is predominant throughout South Carolina and much of the South. And while on its face that is not a problem, it does prevent more dense development and more housing units, and it really throws off sort of the financial feasibility of how we use our land. So, single family houses use more land per home than any other type of development, and I think there's a real fear for opening up our zoning code to allow for more dense development. But there are gentle ways that we can do that if we can just get comfortable with it. We're not talking about building Manhattan-like skyscrapers in, Pickens, South Carolina, but I mean, adding some townhomes here and there, duplexes, making accessory dwelling units available. Those things get us a long way towards providing more supply and using our land a lot more efficiently.
Mm-hmm. Mm-hmm. Yeah, I see heads nodding from the panelists. Anyone want to add to that or comment on that that's on the panel? You raised so many good points, Amy, particularly around getting comfortable with the D word.
It's a hard one, I know, but I think we've got to kind of get over it, right? That's a whole nother conversation, right? Like how we kind of start building a coalition and the way we talk about things, and how we kind of recognize this phenomenon of community opposition to more development is really detrimental in a lot of ways, I think. And it comes from a good spot, right? It comes from a good place where people want to maintain their communities and protect communities, but it really has some really nasty unintended consequences that I think, particularly in this moment where we're really thinking about structural racism in land use and a lot of really things that have been happening for a long time, perhaps there's an opening to really think about housing density and equity in a much different way.
That would be nice, but density is such a volatile word in most communities. They're just so afraid of it. And we've always talked about, well, maybe if we educate them on what density can really do for affordable housing and how it doesn't have that big an impact on other neighborhoods. But even after explaining all that to them, I think they turn their ears off, and don't want to hear the benefits of density. So I'm not sure how to break through that.
I think part of the challenge, can you hear me?
Yeah.
I think part of the challenge is developers and residents want a clear picture of what's going to be built on a site. And unfortunately, that's a lot of the times that's done in isolation of everything else around it.
Mm-hmm.
Right now, Spartanburg is going through its comprehensive plan process, and we're having those kinds of conversations. Residents want clarity on what does my neighborhood look like, and what does we have several instances where the neighborhood supported density. Actually, I was shocked. The neighborhood supported density in the neighborhood because they saw the value of increasing their housing supply in their community. Not every neighborhood agrees with that, but the ones that do, you see a positive outcome for that community. I think if we do comprehensive planning processes that include residents and the conversation about what density actually looks like and how the zoning and site plan review process helps with creating the vision of what the neighborhood wants, I think we'll see more density supported in communities. But it's got to be in the context of how does this fit with other surrounding properties, not just isolated locations.
Yeah.
Yeah.
And maybe we don't call it density. Maybe we call it housing choice. One size doesn't fit all. It's different.
We need to rebrand.
Yeah, the one thing I would throw in here that I occasionally, when I'm speaking about this issue, I think about where do people go on vacation? Well, in 2019, there was this thing called vacations, you may remember. So, but if you think about where people travel when they're going somewhere, they're going, nobody. You think about the destination, it's either like a beachfront resort where you're on foot, or it's a theme park where if you go to Disney World, you take the monorail in and then you're on foot, or you're going to a major city. Nobody vacations in a suburb with 2-acre lot subdivisions. And it occurs to me, why don't we design where we live to be more like the places we spend money to go when we have time off? And typically those are places that are walkable, that have higher levels of density, that have interesting architecture, that are engaging, and yeah, and so that's sort of where I'm at. Everything Amy said was great, and in addition to being an SD housing, I'm also a county planning commissioner, so I'm trying to sort of breathe a different perspective into that process from that direction as well, because zoning and land use restrictions are at the local level are pretty much the whole ballgame. You can't address these broader housing issues without a different approach when it comes to land use plan.
So Dr. Grady, to add to that, I would love to live in the places I visit. I would love to live in downtown Charleston. I'd love to live there. Can't afford it.
Right.
So
Yeah.
I can afford 2 weeks or a week. I can't afford a whole year.
For sure. Yeah.
That's just it, right?
Yeah, I couldn't agree with you more, Brian. I do think that's an interesting phenomenon that, that the Disneyland Main Street has always fascinated me, that you like all around small towns are dying for complicated economic reasons, but we choose to go vacation. This storybook kind of fairy tale Main Street. But I wanted to say one other thing about the density question, and I totally agree with Debbie that the D word is hard. It's been hard for a long time. But my own little way of trying to fight back against that, I think sometimes it's a reactionary kind of thing. I think people like community change is hard. You see construction happening. People have a visceral reaction to just seeing that physically happen in this place that they expect to stay static, or the same or comfortable for them. And I think, just personally in my life, when I'm out to dinner with friends or people are talking about like, oh, did you see it's often multifamily that's happening somewhere around. And I think there's an easy way. Well, it's not easy, but like I've started to call people out on that and say, well, are you also concerned about housing? Because I've heard these same people talk about how it's so expensive to live here. Well, you should be a housing advocate. You should be an advocate for more. And I think there's a lot of kind of counterintuitive things that people don't take that next step to think about how denser development kind of contributes to a lot of good, including housing people and making housing more affordable. And if it's in the right place, hopefully some transit ready places as well. So it's both personal, it's really political, housing political, emotional, but I've also been trying to think about it as also personal and kind of talk to people about, like, not just letting those conversations go by and kind of saying, you need to support this in your community. So.
Right. We had a similar sort of conversation about this at the staff level this morning. You're exactly right. We talk about housing and we talk about systems and we talk about transportation and planning and zoning. And like the end user of all of those things are individual people. And so I think at a certain point, it becomes a question that we need to ask ourselves around, like, what do we really think people, all individuals, regardless of where they work or what they do or who they are, do they deserve a safe, affordable place to live?
Yeah.
When you peel it all back, that's what it boils down to. And if it's a dense development, if it's near where you currently live or whatever, like, do you think all people deserve a place to live?
Mm-hmm.
And the one thing I would just add, and this is just something that jumped out at me as somebody who's not a native South Carolinian, came here about 2 years ago. The first thing everybody said to me, it seemed like, was, well, South Carolina is a rural state. There's 5 million people who live here. It always struck me as odd. It was like, there are more states with fewer people in South Carolina than more. It's sort of a mindset thing where people don't, even if they live in a city, they don't seem to think that they live in a city. And I don't know how you address that or how you work through that, but it's sort of it's just something that jumped out at me where people seem to have this perception that South Carolina doesn't have any big cities and you don't need to worry about density. And it's like, no, I don't think that's accurate. So I just wanted to throw that in, just as something that jumped out at me as a Yankee interloper.
Spoken like a true Yankee, Brian. For sure.
Yeah. From Ohio, right?
Yes. Like many.
Yes. We are so glad you're here. What a gift you have given us with your presence and your data and your statewide housing needs assessment. Martin, I want to hear from you. The city of Spartanburg really has quite a lot going on that really sort of plays on all of these issues from the individual people. I mean, you were just talking about how you were able to garner support for, dense developments within a neighborhood, to zoning, to land use. I mean, you all are really doing a lot in Spartanburg. You want to talk to us a little bit about what you all are doing and sort of the scope of the spectrum of housing options that you all are working on in Spartanburg? It's really just amazing what you all are undertaking.
So, Anna, we're going through, the city of Spartanburg is engaging consultants, town, urban planning and development, TPUDC, and there are consultants that are working with us in the city's comprehensive plan. We see the need for a comprehensive plan because ours currently is very, very old. It was actually developed before the economic decline or economic crash or whatever you want to call 2008, 2009 time period. But over the last couple of years, we've been working with United Way of the Piedmont. The city always works with partners to try to figure out and solve a lot of the issues that we're facing. Housing is one of them. We have others as well. We've been working with United Way of the Piedmont and Hannah Jarrett on a housing committee, now rebranded to be Opportunity Housing Collaborative, to develop information and an action plan for housing. Over the years, we've been trying to understand Spartanburg's housing challenges. We developed a report. The United Way prepared a report for Spartanburg County on its housing challenges. The city did a housing market study about a year ago, and we've also worked with enterprise community partners to put together an Opportunity 360 report, just to get some basics on what the issues are in the city. And so we know that there are housing challenges for homeowners as well as renters. 50% of our renters are cost burdened. They pay more than 30% of their income on rent. In a lot of cases, for Spartanburg, median income rent is about $64,000. Rent has been increasing about 2 to 4% a year, every year. So between this year and last year, we saw rents and incomes, average rents and incomes increase about 4% over the last year. So that means for a family of four, you're looking at 80% of median income. That's about $51,000. That's considered affordable. And for a single person, that's $36,250. And then where most of the low-income housing tax credits development come in at 60% of median income, family of four is about $38,820, and then single person is about $27,180. 3-bedroom rents are about $1,057, and 2-bedroom rents about $795. So several years ago, probably around after 2008, one of the neighborhoods that was hard hit by the economic decline was the Northside neighborhood. The city partnered with former Mayor Barnett to develop a strategy for redeveloping that area. The partners that were involved vary from the Spartanburg Housing Authority to nearby colleges, universities, organizations that are interested in the improvement of the neighborhood. One of the first initiatives was to develop the leadership potential of neighborhood residents, and that developed into the Voyagers. The Voyagers have been around the country talking about their efforts. They've been locally talking about their efforts and have been recognized nationally and by Wofford College as well. Whenever development is coming to the north side, the Voyagers and the neighborhood leadership are involved from the very beginning, and that guides the potential development to be successful. The north side in 2013 worked with the U.S. Department of Housing and Urban Development and the Spartanburg Housing Authority and others to develop a transformation plan and receive funding for the development of a transformation plan. That plan guides the development in the neighborhood today and beyond. One of the first projects, one of the first things after the transformation plan was developed was to try to get a transformation implementation grant from HUD, and the city and Northside was not successful in getting that. However, continued forward on redeveloping the neighborhood. So you saw a multiple number of projects in the neighborhood, including 3 new market tax credit developments within half a mile of each other. Over the last 3 years, you're seeing bond development, low-income housing tax development, and market rate development occurring in the neighborhood. We're talking about close to 700 units of housing within half a square mile of each other being developed over that time period. And we're seeing more units that are coming with the neighborhood working on ownership opportunities as well as additional rental opportunities. One of the first developments, housing developments in the neighborhood was the Brawley Block, which was 21 units of duplexes and a single family rental that involved Spartanburg Housing Authority, NDG, Homes of Hope. It included home funds, private financing, and bank financing, mixed income, and it's a duplex and single families. One of the challenges when the North Side started was all of the substandard and vacant lots in the neighborhood. The neighborhood worked with the SC Housing through the NIP Neighborhood Initiative Program and the NSP Neighborhood Stabilization Program grants, acquire and demolish substandard structures in the neighborhood. And that has developed into a large amount of land bank properties that's owned by the NDG, Northside Development Group, and the city and others try to implement a lot of these developments. These developments are not without their challenges. Amy mentioned a lot of them. One of the challenges that we have in Spartanburg is our tax structure. Our rental property tax structure is very high. Many of the developers are telling us that taxes here in Spartanburg are 2 or 3 times where compared to other places, including in-state. And that has led to innovative opportunities to try to reduce those taxes so development could occur in Spartanburg with a fee in lieu of taxes process. And I can add more if you have more, but I know we're running out of time. We need to hear from Debbie as well.
Yeah, I thank you, Martin. I knew this was going to happen with the panel. There's just too much to talk. I mean, I could talk to each one of you separately for hours about what you're presenting. So, Martin, and I think this is a good pivot to Debbie. What I think is so incredible about what Spartanburg is doing is just, you talked so much about partnerships and community involvement. Like, it's very clear that the city is a partner in these efforts, and that the community, and you mentioned specifically the Voyagers are leading these efforts. Debbie, you're involved right now with the creation of a community land trust. Talk to us, for those who are listening who may not know, tell us what a community land trust is, and sort of what is the neighborhood involvement look like in the sort of creation and administration of a community land trust.
Okay, yes, in North Charleston, we have created the Community First Land Trust. And in general, a classic community land trust is a nonprofit organization that sort of banks land into their land trust. The organization will maintain ownership of the land. Any structures built on that land would be owned by a independent homeowner who would become a member of the land trust. We use a 99-year renewable ground lease to put these properties on and work with them on, creating their homes. We can also take existing homes and add them into the land trust as well, and that is an option for current homeowners. We can also do rental properties. Same kind of situation. If it's new construction of, say, a duplex or a triplex, or even a single family home rental property, again, the land trust would own the land. We would enter into a ground lease with the owner of the structure on that land, and they would become a member of the land trust. Now, one of the purposes of creating a land trust is it kind of prevents gentrification of that land. There's no way a developer could come in, knock on a door and say hi, and try to make the homeowner an offer they can't refuse, because they're now a member of the land trust. So that really helps preserve the land. The focus of the community land trust is to build affordable housing for those neighborhoods. And in the case of the Community First Land Trust, we are currently developing properties in Union Heights in North Charleston, South Carolina. We hope to, in the future, expand the land trust into some of the other what are called the 7 mitigation neighborhoods of North Charleston that were negatively impacted by the movement of the port from downtown Charleston to the old naval base. And we lost over 100 houses that would have been considered affordable housing in those neighborhoods. So now we're kind of like behind in our effort to create affordable housing and replace those units we lost. One unique feature of a community land trust is what's called a tripartite board of directors, or a governance. There are 3 types of board members. There are land trust members. There are community members, which are people that live in the area where the land trust exists, but they might not necessarily live on a land trust property. And then there are public members or representatives that are also on the board of directors. So at all times, there's kind of an equal number of these 3 groups. And that makes sure that the governance is never actually controlled by one faction or another and stays focused on the land trust itself. It's harder to put together than you would think. We've been working on this for quite a while. It's not just an easy kind of nonprofit that wants to do housing development. There's a lot more that goes into it. There's, the ground lease agreements. There's, putting that very particular governance in place for the board of directors. There's stewardship agreements. There are, you have to select an index you'll use for, determining any kind of wealth adjustment on properties. If, like in the future, a homeowner wants to sell their house, the land would stay in the land trust. They would just sell the structure on top of that land. So that's a new feature for a lot of people. And also it's working with banks on providing mortgage loans for homeowners who want to buy a house that's in a land trust. Banks in South Carolina are not that familiar with how that ground lease structure works. And so there's a lot of education involved. And we do spend a lot of time on that as well. So that's it. Now, although we focus on affordable housing, you can also do commercial and retail development and land trusts. And I'm not going to really speak anymore about that because I'm not sure how that works, but because we just do affordable housing. But I thought I'd throw it out there in case anyone's interested. There are a lot of groups who have contacted us who are interested in starting their own community land trust. And I try to say to them, if you're close to an existing land trust, I would recommend joining that land trust rather than starting your own. It's not easy. Check around. There are other land trusts in the state of South Carolina. So and you can have land trust properties that are scattered site. They don't have to be contiguous. So you could essentially have the land trust, let's say in the Union Heights neighborhood, and then maybe in Mount Pleasant, in the 6 Mile neighborhood might want to start a land trust or join the existing land trust with Community First. So, there are different ways to do that, but I would say don't reinvent the wheel and join an existing land trust. It'll far less headaches. But,
well, I'm sure some of the, aspirin or ibuprofen that you consumed for your headaches was related to raising the funding to get the land trust off the ground. How did you do that?
Well, that's pretty much like any nonprofit does. We apply for grants, work with different foundations, try to pull together the money. The first necessary capital money that must come in is for operating costs. There are legal fees that we're going to have, and board insurance, all the typical things that a new nonprofit has. Beyond that, there's also acquisition of land, which is a big capital need. Fortunately, we also work with community partners such as LAMC, which is the Low Country Alliance for Model Communities, which had started to land bank properties with Metanoia. And so we work with Metanoia as well, and we're able to take a couple of those properties in Union Heights, and those are the ones we're currently developing. And there's some additional properties as well. Plus there were mitigation funds from the State Ports Authority and Palmetto Rail that are being used to put into the development of these properties. So we had resources to get started with, but none of that covers operating funds. So we're back to, fundraising for operating funds, which is the hardest part of any nonprofit.
Yeah.
Yeah, so those are the capital needs.
Well, sounds like next year you may be doing a workshop on community. We'll do a deep dive on community land trust and how they work and lessons learned. I am hearing from Kelly that we have some questions in the chat box, and let me see. I'm afraid to try to use my mouse again. Kelly, are you going to read these? I can't see them.
Yes, I will read them. Can you all hear me?
Yes, we can.
Yes.
And just,
All right.
I know we're pushing up against time. Our panelists have agreed to stay on a little past 2. So for those of you who can hang with us, please do. We'll keep it going until the questions are answered.
Yes. And this is recorded, so if you have to hop off before your question's answered, you will be sent a recording of it. So our first question here, we have a newly formed housing foundation. We would like to develop affordable and workforce housing. What % of income paid by tenant homeowner defines affordable workforce housing?
I guess I'll take that one. So workforce housing is, I think, one of those terms where you ask 10 different people what it means and you'll get 10 different answers. Because there's not a legal definition for it. The first thing I would tell you is if you want to develop affordable housing in South Carolina, please give us a call at SC Housing, because that's part of what we do is we're trying to cultivate a robust community of affordable housing developers in South Carolina. So as a bit of an overview, so we have, if you're a small to mid-sized developer, we have our small rural development program, which currently has a mix of federal home dollars, National Housing Trust Fund, and State Housing Trust Fund, each of which has their own eligibility requirements. But generally speaking, you're talking about most of the units are going to need to be below 50 to 60% of area median income. And Martin gave those numbers for Spartanburg. It's a little different county by county, but not dramatically different throughout the state. Low-income housing tax credit, as discussed, currently capped at 60% of AMI. And these are calculated every year by HUD. But that's sort of your threshold. And then there's, for each of those programs, there's a maximum rent that you can charge. And so the economics of it are pretty complicated. You're going to have to break out some pretty serious Excel spreadsheets to work through it. But certainly we would encourage you, if you got an idea, especially if you got some land already and you've got some local buy-in, give us a holler. If your community has, as Greenville, Spartanburg, Charleston potentially have local trust funds, certainly speak with them. It varies a lot based on the funding source, and in many cases, there's a lot of different funding sources rattling around. So it's hard to give a blanket answer, but we're willing to help.
Yeah. The South Carolina Community Loan Fund can help with that too. Our loan officers can walk through our housing affordability worksheets with you and sort of help you pencil out what you're thinking about in terms of, the maximum amount of rent that you can charge versus what a tenant's income would need to be to be considered for it to be considered affordable housing. So to Brian's point, it usually does involve spreadsheets and different funding sources. So we're also happy to be a resource there.
Great. We have another question here. Do any of your organizations hire individuals on a consultant basis to package loans for customers wishing to apply to various home loan programs? For example, USDA hires loan packagers for their 502, 504 programs.
We do not. ULI does not do that, but
we do not either. We do not do any direct consumer lending, so we do not do mortgage lending. We finance the creation, preservation, and rehabilitation of affordable housing. So we would actually offer financing to the developer of the housing.
Right, and that's how SC Housing works on the rental side. We also do have our home buyer programs that offer mortgages with down payment assistance, and we can certainly direct you for more details on that.
Great. Next question. We have a lot of rental properties that are becoming Airbnbs. This makes the rental price high. What can we do to offset this trend?
Is this person with the municipality? I guess we
No.
can't ask questions. Okay.
that's a hard one.
Yeah, that is.
Well, the way that most communities are tackling that issue is through zoning ordinances and city ordinances. But it has to be, typically it's a municipality, a city that's tackling that issue. Currently, we don't have an ordinance, but we're going through our comprehensive plan process. I'm sure it'll come up as we see increased tourism in Spartanburg. I'm sure that will be an issue that we'll be addressing. But check Greenville, check Charleston. I'm sure they probably have an ordinance, or they probably have an ordinance dealing with Airbnbs.
Yeah,
In the process of revising theirs, so.
I was just going to say the same thing, Debbie. There was a whole task force that was created in Charleston. I think they took 6 months to a year. Debbie might know more to kind of look at the issue and kind of figure out how to close some of those loopholes in specific neighborhoods. But I might be able to find some information on. I think they probably produced at least a report or something before they made some recommendations. But I might be able to find something to share with Anna that can be distributed. Debbie might know more.
Actually, I was in a meeting last week, and all I know is they're still working on it. They haven't really finalized it.
It's been a long time. I mean, it's again, it's
Really
complicated.
has. I can't even think of a community that has sort of solved that.
It's like either just clamp or close it down, or
Yeah.
let it go wild. I mean, there really doesn't seem to be any halfway measure that anyone has come up with.
Yeah.
Right.
I will say, I can't speak to it in detail, but the one that sticks in my head is Louisville, Kentucky. I believe they kind of came up with a mechanism to allow Airbnb, but to regulate it and restrict it in some cases. But basically trying to not punish homeowners who want to rent out a spare room in their house, but deter people from basically doing setting up a hotel without having to go through the regulations for it. That's the one example I know of a city that really spent a lot of time and has gotten some positive attention for what they've done.
Great. Our next comment here really is for Dr. Grady. Thank you for being a Richmond County Planning Commissioner and sharing your expertise with our county. So it's a little shout out. Somebody is also wondering, Mr. Livingston, where can they receive a copy of that report that you were discussing?
So the market study, City of Spartanburg market study is located on the city's website, www.cityofspartanburg.org under neighborhood services. I think it's a draft. We need to update it to the final report. And then Spartanburg, United Way has their study that was conducted. It should be on the UW Piedmont, United Way of the Piedmont website as well.
Great. Our next question, is it true that South Carolina has no statute on cost of living? If so, this does not make sense with rising costs of everything and additional housing challenges. Do y'all know?
I can't speak to that.
Yeah, I'm not.
Okay. We have a question here about opportunity zones. How could opportunity zone designation be advantageous for affordable housing development?
Well, that is one of the goals of that program. I'm sure folks on the panel have some other things to say, but I mean, the idea was to bring financial resources to bear to underserved pieces of our community. It's kind of yet to be determined how that really plays out in implementation. There have been some problems, including the not small problem of land speculation, actually driving up prices of land, which is one of what we talked about, kind of barriers to providing more housing. But I'm sure folks on the panel might have other things to say about the potential of OZ to really impact housing production.
Yeah, there's definitely some challenges. Part of the issue of why it hasn't taken off is as we talked about, LIHTC is sort of the main funding source for affordable housing production, and you got opportunity zones. The problem is the two of them don't really mesh well together because LIHTC basically is designed to lower corporate tax liability, and opportunity zones is designed to reduce individual capital gains tax liability. So they're two different kinds of tax liability, so it's hard to mesh them. There certainly have been some developments that have done it. I think the key, if you're going to try to leverage opportunity zones, is there has to be some local regulation of it, because essentially there's no real requirement that opportunity zone funds have to employ people in the community or have to produce real investment in the community. It can essentially be kind of used as a tax dodge if you don't have those particular guardrails in. It's something that we're actually talking about on the Richland County Planning Commission. What the right mechanism might be there. There's certainly a lot of consultants who have spent a lot of time and made a lot of money thinking about those issues, but it's definitely tricky, but I wouldn't say it's impossible.
Brian, have we had an example? I mean, I know nationwide it's been there have been, a handful of examples of housing developments that have been able to use opportunity zones with LIHTC. Have we had any in South Carolina that you know of?
I'm not aware of any that have directly stacked it. I will say that in our qualified allocation plan, which indicates how the tax credits are allocated, we do have a point incentive to direct people to place affordable housing in opportunity zones, but that's not really fully leveraging the tax benefit, right?
Yeah, and unlike LIHTC, doesn't the governor have to designate census tracts for the opportunity zone financing? Is that correct?
Yeah. When it was originally passed back in 2018, every governor in every state had to designate them. Every state had a different process. Some were good, some were less so. So yes, and ultimately the qualified allocation plan also has to be approved by the governor. It has to be signed by him every year. So there's certainly some, like I said, there's potential synergy, but figuring out how to fit all the pieces together has been a challenge for everybody.
Yeah. And you guys, I just put a link in the chat. Maybe Kelly can get that. I think I put it in the wrong spot, but maybe Kelly can get that to everybody. There's an organization called South Carolina Opportunity Zone, and I don't know if he's CEO or managing principal for that organization is a guy named Mark Elliott, and he's a ULI member, and he's really willing to talk to people through about how these opportunities may be put to good use. So I just put that, Kelly helped me put that link in the chat. So
Yeah, it should be in there.
good resource for more information.
All right, we have a question for Brian Grady. In your research, how many of these rental homes that fall into your rental average do not have mortgages on them? And does that factor into your numbers?
That is a good question. The short answer is no, I don't have those numbers. Certainly there's a lot of housing data that I wish was more freely available that isn't. Whether it has to do with housing quality and physical condition or the financial structure of it. All I can really speak to coherently is most affordable housing that gets a low-income housing tax credit award does typically have some sort of permanent financing. But in terms of a large scale, that's something that's there. I'm not aware of a statewide data set that does that. Maybe there is one through a private search mechanism, but I haven't seen that, unfortunately.
We have a question here about land trusts. Are there examples of traditional land trusts focusing on conservation that are also community land trust space?
I think conservation land trusts are different from community land trusts. Conservation land trusts basically are looking for ways to preserve land from being developed. I mean, there's an East Cooper Community Land Trust in this area. But no, I'm not aware of any community land trusts that also include like conservation land trust, but I'm sure they exist. There's a good website to go to. It's called Grounded Solutions. They're kind of the clearinghouse organization for land trusts throughout the country, and they probably worked individually with every land trust that exists, but they have a huge amount of information about land trusts, and that would be a really good place to go to find out.
Great. We have another question about the land trusts. Were any of the homes, did you have to demolish any homes to make room for the land when you purchased land trusts? And were any of them part of a historical neighborhood?
We have not demolished any properties, and we don't intend to. I mean, we may look at rehab of some existing properties, but we don't intend to tear any houses down.
Great.
We're intent on preserving neighborhoods.
Somebody here asks, what is neighborhood density?
What is neighborhood density? That's the number of housing units within a kind of a geographical area. The higher number, the greater the density. And if you're asking this question because of our earlier conversation about how neighborhoods are afraid of high density, we have found that the greater the density, the lower the cost of housing. And it makes, and you see more services that are created when there's a high density neighborhood area, because there's a lot more business for them. So it's a win-win actually for communities to have a higher density. And we don't mean like skyscraper buildings, but it's just more units within a small area where people can live together, and it just makes economic sense.
Yeah. One question here. What are some strategies to recapitalize housing developments and preserve attainable housing where tax credits are expiring?
Ooh. Brian?
Well, yeah, absolutely.
Dr. Grady?
So that's definitely a challenge. Certainly when we pivoted as a nation away from traditional public housing and Section 8 housing toward LIHTC, for those of you who aren't aware, basically there's a 30-year clock. Once the project is placed in service, they only have to maintain the affordability for 30 years, and in some cases, projects are able to exit affordability at year 15. So there's a number of strategies that can be implemented. One that I haven't seen as much here in South Carolina, but that happened in Ohio a fair bit, was essentially resyndication. So once you have been in the program for 20, 25 years, you need capital reinvestment. You got to fix some things up to keep the building in good shape. So you come back to the housing authority for another round of tax credits, and that restarts the 30-year clock. Now, obviously, that prevents other new housing from being built. That prevents other mechanisms. Certainly there's if it expires at the end of 30 years, obviously if it's in a high demand market, it's probably going to be converted to market rate housing. If it's in a less hot market, there's the potential to try to implement smaller scale strategies. In terms of trying to figure out how to put in a little bit of subsidy to keep people, make their rents affordable. There's certainly not an across the board solution to the problem, unfortunately. Ultimately that's where we think, the thing that I say all the time is, even if we at the State Housing Authority did everything right, never made a mistake, allocate every dollar perfectly. We're not going to fix this ourselves. There really does have to be local money on the table to help with some of these issues. Certainly got to acknowledge Martin in Spartanburg. They recently passed a local housing trust fund statute. So there's one in Greenville. Charleston is evaluating that. That's certainly one of those mechanisms where somebody can come in and with a fairly limited amount of money, fix up the property and place some locally based rent restrictions on it. I think part of the answer is trying to bolster the nonprofit community at large in South Carolina. Something that I would like to see happen is a sort of incubation of more locally based, community driven housing development entities that can kind of do that with a lower level of public subsidy. So the short answer is, as I said, there's not a silver bullet there, but there's a few different options on the table.
Yeah. And that's a good opportunity for me to give a little plug. If you are in county, please visit lowcountryhousingfund.org. You will have a question if you're a Charleston County voter. There are 2 questions. One that authorizes a tax increase. It's 2 mills. It's a relatively small increase on property tax to fund the creation of a housing trust fund. And then second question on the ballot authorizes the county to float a bond for that. So rather than sort of a pay-as-you-go model, all of the money would come, would sort of be available at the beginning. Please visit lowcountryhousingfund.org for additional information. And once you've done that, if you still have questions, please feel free to reach out to me. I'm happy to answer any questions about that. So just want to make sure to get that in there, get the plug in. And I believe that was our last question. So for those of you who are still on the line, thank you for spending some extra time with us. And to our panelists, as always, my deepest gratitude. I always learn something when I'm with you all as individuals and definitely as a group. So thanks for sharing your experience, your knowledge, and your expertise with me and with us. So with that, Kelly, I'll hand it back over to you.
Great. Yeah, thank you all so much. Just a virtual round of applause for everyone's time today. I do want to make note that we have our next summit series on November 18th, which happens to be Global Entrepreneurship Week, and we will be discussing various entrepreneurship programs throughout South Carolina. You can find information for that session in the handouts tab on the GoToWebinar panel. And I also want to remind everyone that for our final session in March, we have special keynote speaker Mersa Baradaran, who is the author of The Color of Money, Black Banks and the Racial Wealth Gap. I got a comment in the question panel about somebody strongly recommends reading The Color of Law by Richard Rothstein, which was actually our keynote speaker for our in-person summit last year. So 2 really important books to read that we'd love to support these authors in their work. And one more plug, be sure to vote. We have a lot of important issues on the ballot this year, including affordable housing. So it's really important that everyone gets their voices heard. On that, I will leave you and we will send a recorded session out shortly today. So thank you again, and everyone have a wonderful afternoon. We'll see you next month.
Thank you.
Thank you.
Thanks, everybody.
Bye-bye.
Bye.